Well, I don't. I usually present, complex scientific kinds of information, but today I'm going to do a once upon a time kind of thing. So the title was the Fred S. Keller School Origins and Scientific Contributions. Actually, Dr. Du, also known as Du Lin in China, and Lin Du here, gave me the title, so I really didn't have any choice. So it's typical with men, so do that. So I did it. So I want to tell you a little bit about the history of this organization. The CABAS model. CABAS stands for the Comprehensive Application of Behavior Analysis in School. Let me put my glasses on. And it began in 1981 in a residential school. The state of New York was going to close this school. And at the time, I was teaching a master's degree program at Letchworth Developmental Center, which is up on the Palisades Highway. It had about 5,000 people with serious developmental and behavioral disorders. I helped close that institution and send people out into group homes. I'm just part of the system, okay? So the state said, told the director of the school, which was then called the Margaret Chapman School, it's now called the Hawthorne Country Day School, that they were going to close this place. It was owned, private ownership, for profit, and they had 48 individuals for about, at that time, I think about 10 until maybe into their 20s and 30s. And they had school, and they had a residence. And so the woman who was in charge of this school came to see me at my office at Teachers College, and she said, well, you can come out and do workshops, help train our staff. And by then, since about 1972, I'd been all over the United States talking about how to set up classrooms and get kids to be nice. And I was disappointed with that. Every time I'd do it, people say, come back next year. So we'd come back and do a talk, and everybody would applaud, and we'd go home. Nothing changed in the classrooms. So I told the woman, who's Eileen Bazori, I said, I won't do workshops, but I'll come every day until you run out of money. Spent 20 years there. The last 3 of that was because of Jessica Duda. But at any rate, and a lot of the people who became critical to the Fred S. Keller School came out of that program. Dr. Nuzola Robin had an amazing and interesting classroom. CC, who later did many things, even in Morristown. Jean Speckman wasn't there, but she was at a sister program for preschool. So at any rate, that school, we just turned it into a total behavioral program. One time I could tell you how many inches high the grass was, how many socks and underwear were missing per kid. So we taught people how to do teaching as behavioral analysis, what we knew at that time. And we taught people to measure every response that every kid does to instruction. And then we developed a curriculum for teachers, which became the modules and the ranks. And we developed a curriculum for the kids. And so after I'd been there about 4 years, the school began to look very different. And kids were doing things they couldn't do before. And a lot of the abuse that went on in the nighttime in the residence were down. So the county of Westchester recognized that. And the director of the programs that run preschools in Westchester at that time, came and asked us if we would do a school for preschoolers for these kids down in southern Westchester. And at that time, it wasn't autism. It was kids with behavior disorders. So we started a school with a couple of people. Nan McCorkle, who was a last year doctoral student of mine, and it was on a grant. Had a grant called the Fred S. Keller Grant. And she was fully funded. And a colleague and former wife, who worked with the corporation I had, decided she wanted to work for the school. So the two of those, we were going to do the school. We had a list of kids, and so I said, okay, when do we get paid? After you do the services in about a year. So we had like 12 kids, 2 people to run this program, and no money. So fortunately I had the grant, and so I got a loan, as Robin was saying, on the house the only house I had was in the middle of the Adirondacks. So we started in a church basement. You'd think churches would be more charitable, but all they gave us was a basement and a cloakroom. So we were there for 6 or 7 months, and then we finally got a place at 356 Nepperhan Avenue. Anybody know where 356 Nepperhan Avenue is? Raise your hand. Okay, Cheryl. Yeah. So we were in the little school there that's a Head Start. So we had about 3 or 4 classrooms. So when we went into that classroom, into that school, we walked on crack vials. So that was the period of time when crack was the drug of choice. So the school then moved eventually to across from the Consumer Reports in the church there, and eventually, finally, moved up to where the Yonkers School is now. So when we got the school, we were trying to decide what to name this school. The person that I had gotten to know who had become a mentor of me was a guy named B.F. Skinner. How many people know who B.F. Skinner is? Raise your hand. Okay, he is the head general of the science of behavior. Okay, he's the guy that developed and identified the operant. And the other guy was Pavlov, and he identified the respondent. So these guys, Skinner became a mentor simply because he looked at my work and I asked him to review it for promotion. And he called me up and said, hey, I'd like to talk to you about your work. And so I started going there on a regular basis. So he became a mentor and a friend in many ways. So why didn't I name the school after Skinner? Well, for one, Skinner was a very famous person at that time. And so I didn't want to abuse the friendship. And secondly, I had just done a book on behavioral procedures with teaching music. And I asked Fred Skinner, Burris, I'm going to call him Burris because the other guy is Fred too, Fred Keller. And I asked Burris, if he would do it. He said, well, I think you should get Keller to do it. Because Keller, you've got a lot of PSI in this book, personalized system of instruction, some of the pieces we do. And I said, I think Fred would be the right person. So I said, I don't know Fred Keller. And so Skinner said, well, I'll introduce you, which involves in those days things like a letter that I sent him the book. And he looked at it and said, okay, I'll write the introduction. The introduction is better written than the book. So the book is called Design for Music Learning, and it's translated into Japanese too. So I got to know Fred a little bit, and pretty soon he was a guy that I talked to a lot. And so I said, Fred, I'd like to name this school after you. And Here's what he said. Only if it'll be a happy school. I said, it will be. And the reason Fred wanted it to be a happy school is connected with the fact that he was a scallywag as a kid. You know what a scallywag is? It's a Scottish expression. He was a bit of a punk. Right? He got into trouble a lot. He didn't do well in school. It took him a long time to do well. So when he was about 18 or 19 years old, this thing called World War I happened. And Fred would often fought World War I, but he ended up doing Morse code and training people in Morse code. So he married someone. And he came back and he got a divorce. And that was notorious in those days for somebody to get a divorce. And so Fred didn't finish high school before he went into the Army. And so when he came home, he got a scholarship playing football for a private school, high school. So he finished high school there, did a degree, and then at the point at which he decided he wanted to do a PhD in psychology, he went off to Harvard. And he met this new guy called Fred Skinner, and they became close buddies. So that's how the two Freds got together and became really good friends. So we did have Fred visit the school, and I think Donna and Cheryl can remember. How many of you remember when Fred Keller came to visit? So he was 95 then, all right? Fred and Frances, his wife Frances, they were quite a couple. She always said, of course, I'm much younger than he is. But Fred was an amazing person. He's the guy that probably taught more people that went on to lead the applied behavior analysis and the science of behavior. People like Charlie Catania, Dick Malott, and just a whole host of people that were really the people that founded the science. Fred was one of the first people to introduce the science of behavior to education. And he introduced it to training undergraduate psychology students at Columbia University. So Fred was, he didn't do a lot of research, but he promoted Skinner's work. And he was probably the best ambassador for the science. Because Fred can go in a room and give a talk, and everybody would love him, and there wouldn't be a dry seat in the house. Okay. You get the metaphor? No? Okay. So, he was a really good spokesman for the science. He came to visit the school at 95 years old, and he said it was a happy school. And Cheryl probably gave him a hug. So I tell you something else about Fred. He called me up the night before he was going to die, and he said, I'm going to die tomorrow. Can you imagine shaking doctors? Work that out. So he was an amazing person. And he had two requests. One was to have a happy school, which he agreed we did have. The second request was, would you get a school like that in Brazil? We never got a school in Brazil, but we've got a book, thanks to Ariel Holanda. We've got a book in Portuguese there, and I'll be going for my 5th time in April. So hopefully we'll get a school in Brazil. But I will say that we did get a school in Cork, Ireland. And Fred Keller's family was from Cork, Ireland. And so we have a Cork Common School there, and at one time it looked just like the Fred S. Keller School. Okay. So enough about, one thing I wanted to say about Fred and Frances before we go into something else. When he spent the night, a couple of nights with me, when he came up to see the school, he had Frances, so it's like midnight, And Francis says, I'm going to bed. And Fred says, let's have a cigar and cognac. All right. And we had just come back from a restaurant. We had walked about 6 or 7 blocks down the Broadway. We ate at a restaurant. And we walked back, and we walked by his apartment. His apartment was right next to mine. I lived in a faculty apartment, and he lived in a faculty apartment for a period of time. And so there were about 16 steps there. I know because I've counted them. And we were walking by, and Fred and Francis were looking at each other, and Fred said, how would you like to go up and look at our old apartment? And Francis says, yeah, that'd be good, Fred. He turned around and he ran up 16 steps. Okay, that's an amazing, I'm thinking about that now at my age, I don't think I could do that. So we went up to his apartment outside, looked outside, and there's this big, this is about 8th floor, right? And there's this big air shaft in the middle with the window. And Francis says, oh, Fred, you remember the time you locked those kids in? Or the kids got locked in and we couldn't get them? And he said, yeah, and you climbed out the window and went around the air shaft? He said, oh, yeah. So that's the kind of guy Fred was, right? He was a person who didn't do well in school and then finally did it. He wrote his autobiography. It's called At My Own Pace. And that's where At My Own Pace comes from, right? When we teach kids, we teach them at their own pace. So, anyway, the other point is that we'd always go to ABBA conferences in the early days. That's the Association for Behavior Analysis. It's their national group. And almost everybody would be in my room. Skinner, Keller, UT Place, Izzy Golddiamond, we always hang out there. And so everybody would finally chase everybody else and I'd go to sleep. But Fred would go to another party. And so the next morning he said, Doug, I heard one of your students saying bad things about you. You're too nice to your students. This was a guy who was 94 years old and had a 70-year-old student. He was still going to their conference, the presentation. So Fred was an amazing person. So I want to talk a little bit about, this is really hard to see it for some reason. So I think we are happy schools. We have shown the Keller schools are always going to be the mothership of Cobas. And Cobas now is in Korea. We have a school in Korea that's an accredited program. We have a school in England. And we have a general education program from preschool through grade 6 in public schools in Morristown, New Jersey. And so it's spreading slowly. It'll always be slow because this is a BMW school. This is not a Ford school. You're not going to get a lot of places that are going to be able to do the kind of level of expertise that we provide for children. So I want you to understand that this is an internationally famous program. There are people around the world who have moved from Australia to have their children go to this school. There are people that have come here and done postdocs from all over the world. Just talking to a young man from Nigeria who's now teaching at Yonkers. We had a postdoc from Nigeria. We've had many postdocs from Brazil, Spain, England, Ireland. And a lot of people would give their right arm to have a program like this for their children, or to have a program like this to work with children. So it's a very, very special place. We've shown that you can do totally science-based teaching, day in and day out, We've shown that we can teach people to measure the responses that kids make to all instruction. I wrote a paper in 1983 advocating that we could have schools based on the science of behavior in a research journal in education. And there was a response to it saying, you can't do a school like that based on science of behavior. You might be able to treat a few problems, but you can't do a school. Fred S. Keller School is now 37 years old. The college model is almost 40 years old. So it's an amazing place. So I want to talk about, just for a few minutes, not only have we helped many, many children to be able to do things they could not do before, and we have taught at least 264 PhDs and hundreds of master's students to be competent strategic scientists of teaching, which is what we're trying to do. But we have saved we have dealt with incredible difficulties that children, that parents of children with disabilities have to deal with. So somebody said to me, I just recently decided I wasn't going to have a retirement party from Columbia University, and somebody said, well, what about your legacy? And I said, my own legacy are the children that come out of our schools. And that's your legacy. So, in addition to that, I wanted to point out what we have done in the way of contributing to the science of behavior. And that's pretty unique. For example, we've identified how language develops, not just with kids with autism, I think, but with all kids. We've identified those developmental cusps and stages by finding children who lack those and then establishing that, what I call stimulus control, that allows them to look more like developmental neurotypical children. So kids with autism have taught us about how typical children develop. That's a pretty amazing phenomenon. And I think that contribution of children with autism, once people finally figure it out in the world at large, is going to be a huge contribution. Most people, when they look at development, they have it, they look at a child and they follow a group of children longitudinally. Well, that's not very good science. And the other thing is to compare them with other species. For example, compare them with apes or chimpanzees. But in our case, we found a developmental sequence simply by saying, oh, this kid doesn't know you're in the room. Oh, well, maybe we can do something so that they'll know you're in the room. We've developed this thing called conditioned reinforcement for faces and voices. Suddenly, they're in the room. Our reality becomes their reality, okay? Nobody had really done that in ABA. Everybody does look at me and reinforce, but they don't understand about these cusps. That's a critical step. All the way from there to understanding how children learn language without being taught, which we call incidental bidirectional naming. Then you'll hear people talking about that. All right? That's a major accomplishment. We haven't convinced the rest of the world, and maybe I'm not totally right, but I would bet my kids' life on it, and my kids are your kids. So we have also identified how to assess and establish those VB cusps. That's pretty amazing. There are a lot of things we don't do, but it started in Keller. And that alone is an amazing contribution. We identified, as I showed before, as I said, how to run schools totally based on the science of behavior. You guys, some of you have been doing this so long that you just think this is the way schools run. We're probably the only preschool that is so data intensive. You can a parent can walk in and we can show them how a kid is doing exactly what they're doing moment to moment. If you're a parent, you would love to have that for your child. It's amazing. We identify this phenomenon called conditioned reinforcement by denial. I first found that phenomenon by getting a kid to swallow and never swallow. And then the next thing is we did it in 356 Neperhan with a little kid who wouldn't eat his food. And we eventually found out that if you give a kid a piece of string as a reinforcer, it's not going to work as a reinforcement, is it? But if we put him next to a kid, and Dr. Dudak has done it, most of the work on this, you put him next to another kid who gets a string for doing something, the other kid's going to want it. And it's not only going to be just for a short term. 6 months later, a kid will just work for a piece of string. I started with all bran cereal. And then we did it with bean sprouts. And then we did it with canned Brussels sprouts. And then we did it with dry grits. And then we did a piece of string. And that is a third way to condition reinforcers. The first is operant conditioning. Second is respondent. The third one is conditioned reinforcement by denial. It ain't been since B.F. Skinner that we introduced a new principle. So that's pretty hot stuff. And of course, stereotypy is a function of the lack of conditioned reinforcers. 1983, first publication about that. That's how you decrease stereotypy. You build other reinforcers for people. If you don't believe it, next time you go to the airport and don't have anything to do, count your stereotypy. All right, we all engage in stereotypes. The stereotypy is fun. It's called a rocking chair. It's just you don't want to do it, because you don't have anything else to do. Okay, so those are important contributions. There are a few more. Pre-verbal foundational cuts, listener cuts, speaker cuts, the joining of the listener and the speaker. And this is something you may not know as much about because we've done more of this in general ed, is all those verbal developmental cuts are critically related to reading and writing. So lots of times kids have problems with reading and writing, and people in general ed don't know why that's the case. A lot of times because they're missing a cusp. And a cusp is a function of a kind of reinforcement stimulus control. And if you can change that stimulus control, then it will allow them to be able to read more effectively. Like when we teach kids to read, the first thing we do is condition reinforcement to look at a page. We're the only people in the world that do that. And they learn 4 to 10 times faster. And the same thing happens with older kids. You condition content as a reinforcer. And if you do that, they go up 2 or 3 grade levels in 3 weeks. Amazing. But that started here. So, here's some more. Conditioned reinforcement for looking at books. I said that. Conditioned reinforcement for playing with math objects. I bet you didn't know this. This is the preschool at Morristown, but it came out of our work here. That if you condition kids playing with math objects, they learn math 4 to 10 times faster. Who thought? Increased learn units lead to mastery of objectives. We invented learn units in this school, right? Learn units is also based on a history that goes all the way back to Skinner's program of instruction. But there's still people in the field that don't understand about learn units. Corrections are key doing those corrections are really important. Turns out by the time you get to be in 5th grade, observing people's corrections is how you learn by observation. Started here. More TPRAs. Well, we actually started TPRAs at the Margaret Chapman School. I invented the TPRA. And it turned out to be pretty interesting, pretty powerful. And then we learned more when we got to preschool. And of course, when we got general ed, we understood that, you could do an entire algebra problem that could be one learn unit. So that's a very important contribution. Our teacher training modules, which is, by the way, the curriculum that we used for master's and doctoral students at Columbia University for many, many years. And we have used those teacher ranks. The module in those teacher ranks predict how well the children in the classroom will do. It's the only training I know in education that identifies the particular behaviors teachers should have in order to have an effect on children. That's only here. So those modules, as you know, include contingency shift, which is what you do in the classroom, right? How well you run those programs, how well accurately record them, whether you make the right moves at the right time with the child. But there are all these other modules, like doing a poster, doing data, which is called verbally mediated, learning what positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, learning what event recording is, learning what responses to learn units are. All of those are part of the curriculum for the teachers. So we have a curriculum for the kids. The kids drive what everybody else does only because of measurement by the teachers. Measurement makes the school learner driven, right? And measurement of teachers' behavior improves kids. Kids only do as well as the teachers teach. Going through those modules and those ranks mean that more kids are going to get better outcomes. Same thing goes with the supervisor. If they don't do the rates right, we don't get the kinds of outcomes. If they're not doing more TPRAs, the teachers don't do as well, kids don't learn. If I don't come in and monitor somebody like me and say, you guys doing all the pieces, then it doesn't work. So we are all cybernetically connected, so that measurement then of everybody's responses is really important. So we know that with some of our schools and some of our kids, we get 4 to 7 times more learning than a kid would in the typical preschool. We also know that that more TPRAs by supervisors and more decision checks by supervisors mean better outcomes for kids, mean better teaching for teachers, hence better outcomes for kids. We also know PPRAs. How many knows what a PPRA is? It's not something we can do with toilet training. What's a PPRA?
It's a measurement of parent performance rate and accuracy.
Right. So we have a dissertation, a couple of studies. When you do that with parents, their kids perform better. They do better. So then a decision protocol. The decision protocol is not used and known by most people in applied behavior analysis, but it's a critical component. It helps us move from simply doing the same thing over and over to identifying why a kid's not learning and what to do in order to fix that problem. All of this is made possible by you people and the people who have been teachers and in a school before you. So you should be very proud to be part of this program. You are the next most important individuals in the program besides the kids. So you should be very proud of that.